"We're cutting the fat," Calvin Reyes declared, not even bothering to take a seat. "No room for deadweight. You're out." I blinked at the 31-year-old who had been president of Ashwood Components for precisely 7 hours and 12 minutes. The ink on the sleek Stanford MBA certificate behind him was barely dry, and the frame still had the clearance sticker on it. "I see," I replied, my voice calm, despite the thunderous mix of disbelief and rage rumbling inside. 11 years, gone in 10 seconds. "Can I ask why?" I said evenly. Calvin's lips twisted into a smirk he probably thought passed for a confident executive's grin. "My uncle might have needed a crutch to walk him through every negotiation, but this company's changing. We're streamlining. Modernizing." I nodded slowly, still holding the stack of department reports I'd been reviewing when his assistant buzzed my office. Reports that ironically included notes on my own recently renegotiated contract. "I'll need that in writing, of course," I said, standing from the visitor's chair, still faintly warm from the former CEO, Harold Reyes, who'd retired just last week. "HR will have something for you to sign on the way out," Calvin said with a shrug, already clicking away at his laptop. "Security will walk you out. Just protocol." I gathered my pen and notepad, keeping the same cool composure that had carried me through over a decade of delicate vendor standoffs, high-stakes audits, and million-dollar client rescues. "Thank you for the opportunity to work here," I said. He looked almost disappointed that I wasn't crying or yelling. "Best of luck, Elena." As I packed my things into a box under the watchful eye of a security guard I knew by name, Jason, who always brought donuts on Fridays, my phone buzzed with messages. Word travels fast on the executive floor. But I ignored them. Focused. In the back drawer of my desk, exactly where I'd left it, was a hard copy of my employment agreement. The one Harold had personally rewritten 3 years ago, right after Tricon Manufacturing had tried to lure me away. "You all set?" Jason asked quietly, clearly uncomfortable. "Almost." I slid the agreement into my shoulder bag. "Just need to say goodbye to a few folks." I didn't. I walked straight past my stun team, into the bright Detroit morning and into my car. Only then did I let the smallest smirk creep onto my face. I pulled out the contract and flipped to the clause I knew by memory. Section 17, Paragraph C, change in executive leadership, termination within 30 days triggers a full severance payout, stock vesting acceleration, and a non-compete nullification. Calvin Reyes had just made a 6-figure mistake before his first lunch break. My journey with Ashwood began at 29, fresh out of a modest Midwestern law school with a specialization in corporate contracts. I'd applied to every manufacturing firm in the region, and to my surprise, Harold himself had interviewed me. "Most legal types just nod and approve," he'd said, leaning back in his worn leather chair. "I need someone who'll call out the landmines before I step on them." I was hired the next day. Over time, I became more than legal counsel. I was Harold's fixer, called in when suppliers backed out, when client contracts unraveled, when legislation blindsided the company. I saved Ashwood millions, and for that, Harold ensured I was protected. Calvin thought he was cutting fat. Turns out, he just amputated the company's right arm with a platinum severance package in the pocket. 3 years ago, Tricon Manufacturing, Ashwood Components' fiercest rival, had come after me with an offer that almost knocked me off my feet. The salary alone made my eyes water. But it wasn't just the money. They offered a team, autonomy, stock incentives, the works. When I brought the offer to Harold Reyes, I didn't expect him to match it. But he did. And more. He didn't just counter with equal pay, he handed me an employment agreement that showed exactly how much he valued me. A full year's severance. Accelerated equity vesting. A golden parachute clause that activated if I was ever let go without cause. And most importantly, a trigger clause that guaranteed payout in the event of leadership change and immediate termination. "Your family now, Elena," Harold had said as we signed the agreement. "Ashwood wouldn't be what it is without you." I believed him. And for 6 more years, I gave everything I had to that company. Then Harold announced his retirement. We all knew his nephew Calvin would take over. Nepotism doesn't die in a boardroom just because a company claims to value merit. But no one expected how fast things would unravel. In the final weeks before Harold's departure, I started noticing Calvin watching me in meetings. Not listening, watching. Calculating. When I presented the Q2 compliance report with detailed risk assessments, he waved it off as unnecessary red tape. "You're slowing innovation," he said with a smirk. Harold had my back as always, but I saw the shift happening in real time. That night, I opened a blank document and started updating my resume. What I hadn't expected was the abruptness. No warning, no meeting with HR, not even the illusion of restructuring. Just a smug smile and "you're out." As I drove home through downtown Detroit, past the Ashwood sign I had walked under for over a decade, I wondered if Calvin had even skimmed my file before signing off on my termination. Probably not. He didn't see a person, just a shadow of his uncle's era he wanted to erase. Later that evening, I spread out my employment agreement across the dining room table beside the freshly printed termination notice HR had shoved into my hands. The contrast was almost laughable. One document was the product of weeks of negotiation and legal precision. The other? A one-page form with my last name misspelled. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in a long time. "Leonard Phillips," came the voice on the other end. "Leonard, it's Elena Ward." "Elena? What a surprise. How's life at Ashwood?" I hesitated for a beat. "That's actually why I'm calling. I was let go today." A pause. "You're joking. Harold?" "No," I said. "Harold retired." It was Calvin. Another pause, longer this time. "I see. Well," he said, voice shifting to business mode. "His loss may be someone else's gain." Funny timing. We're expanding operations in Detroit. Could really use someone with deep knowledge of Ashwood's contracts and internal practices. I smiled. "I thought you might say that." Before he could continue, I added, "But you should know I had an agreement. Significant provisions for termination." "Do tell," Leonard said, intrigued. I walked him through it all, the severance, the accelerated equity, the trigger clause. By the end, he whistled. "That's quite the golden parachute." Bet Calvin didn't read a word of it. "Doubt it," I said. By the end of our hour-long call, I had a verbal offer, double my Ashwood salary. Full leadership over Tricon's new strategic initiatives in Detroit. A formal offer was on its way in the morning. I leaned back, taking in the sight of both documents again, my termination notice and my golden agreement. Shock? Yes, but also opportunity. My phone buzzed. A message from Diane, my old assistant. "Are you okay?" I smiled. "Better than okay. Everyone's in shock," Diane wrote. "Harold is flying back tomorrow." I hadn't expected that. He was supposed to be halfway through a month-long cruise in the Mediterranean to celebrate his retirement. If he was cutting that short, it meant Calvin had likely told him about my departure. "I'm fine," I replied, just surprised at the timing. Calvin called an all-hands. Said he's bringing in his own team. New direction, and all that. That explained everything. Calvin wasn't just letting me go, he was systematically tearing down what Harold had spent decades building. My dismissal wasn't personal. It was strategic. He wanted a clean slate, no matter the cost. "Keep me posted," I texted back, then set my phone aside. I gathered the papers from my dining table and tucked them into a navy leather folder, the termination notice, my employment contract, my notes from the call with Leonard at Tricon. Tomorrow was going to be interesting, but not in the way Calvin Reyes expected. I arrived at Ashwood Components just after 9 a.m., not as an employee, but as someone with unfinished business. The lobby looked the same as it had every morning for the last 11 years, sleek, bright, and a little too sterile. The receptionist, Tracy, did a visible double take when she saw me. "Elena, I mean, Ms. Ward. We heard. Is Harold in?" I asked, calm and composed. Her eyes widened. "Yes, he came in early. He's with Calvin in the third-floor conference room. But I don't think." "Thank you, Tracy," I said with a smile, already walking toward the elevators, my heels echoing sharply against the polished marble floor. As the elevator doors opened to the executive level, I heard the shouting before I even stepped out. Harold's voice. Stern, unmistakable, and very, very angry. Did you even read her contract before firing her? I walked toward the conference room slowly, noting the group of assistants and middle managers pretending to work at their desks, while clearly straining to hear every word of the confrontation. Diane saw me first. Her eyes went wide as she rushed over. Elena, what are you doing here? I have a meeting, I said smoothly. With who? Before I could answer, the conference room door swung open with a thud. Calvin stormed out, his face red with frustration, only to freeze when he saw me standing there. What are you doing here? He snapped. Before I could answer, Harold appeared behind him. Unlike his nephew, Harold looked genuinely glad to see me. Elena. Perfect timing. Come in, he said, gesturing toward the room behind him. Then, to the hovering crowd, the rest of you, back to work. Inside the conference room, the long table was littered with documents, including several copies of my employment agreement. At the far end sat Veronica Wyatt, the head of HR, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. Ms. Wyatt was just explaining to Calvin why your termination might be problematic, Harold said, closing the door behind us. Veronica cleared her throat. As I was saying, the agreement Ms. Ward signed 3 years ago included several protections in the event of termination. I know exactly what it includes, I said, stepping forward and placing my folder on the table. 1 year's severance at my current salary. Immediate vesting of all outstanding stock options. A waived non-compete. And most importantly, full consulting rights for any competitor of my choosing. I paused just long enough to make sure Calvin was actually listening. Oh, I added, and a $250,000 early termination payout if dismissed without cause. Calvin's face cycled through disbelief, panic, and poorly concealed fury. Harold, on the other hand, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and nodded approvingly. It was just the beginning. The emotions came in waves, disbelief, then anger, and finally something closer to panic. That can't be right, Calvin muttered, grabbing one of the printed agreements and flipping through it with shaking hands. Page 7. Paragraph 4, I offered helpfully, standing calmly across the table. Harold watched his nephew with a look that blended disappointment and quiet resignation. I tried to teach you to read the fine print before making decisions, he said, voice steady but tinged with sadness. This is why. Calvin found the clause. His face turned a shade paler as he read it again. But this is legally binding, he stammered. It is, I confirmed. Signed by you, Harold, and still in full effect. Harold turned to me then, his features softening. Elena, I want to sincerely apologize for my nephew's actions. Your termination is officially rescinded. Effective immediately. Your office, your responsibilities, everything will be restored. I had expected this, of course. Harold had always been loyal to those who proved their value, and he'd never left someone in the cold who had served him faithfully. But loyalty wasn't what had brought me back to Ashwood Components that morning. I appreciate the offer, I said, voice firm but polite. But I've already accepted a position elsewhere. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by the dull thunk of Calvin dropping the agreement onto the table. Where? Harold asked, though something in his tone told me he already knew. Tricon Manufacturing, I replied. I start next Monday as Director of Contract Management and Compliance. Calvin scoffed. You can't. Your non-compete was waived upon termination without cause, I said, cutting him off. Page 9. Paragraph 2. Harold slowly lowered himself into one of the chairs, his shoulders heavy. For the first time, he looked every bit his 65 years. You've been planning this. No, I said honestly. But when the opportunity presented itself, I would have been foolish not to take it. Calvin was already spiraling. They'll want our client lists, pricing structures, supplier contracts, all of which I'm legally allowed to reference, I said evenly. Given how my employment ended, then I turned to Harold. Though I should clarify, my agreement with Tricon specifically prohibits me from using any proprietary information from Ashwood. Leonard Phillips may be a competitor, but he's not unethical. Harold nodded, unsurprised. He and Leonard had been friendly rivals for decades, men who competed hard but respected boundaries. Then he looked at me again. "What do you want, Elena?" The question caught me off guard. "Excuse me? You could have walked away with your payout and started fresh next week," he said. "But you came back here. So, what do you want?" I paused, considering it. What did I want? Revenge? Closure? Some sense of satisfaction from seeing Calvin flounder? Maybe all of the above. "I want what I'm owed," I said finally. "And I want to make sure the people who still work here are treated fairly." Calvin rolled his eyes. "This is a business, not a charity." "Your uncle built this business by valuing his people," I shot back. "That's why Ashwood has one of the lowest turnover rates in the industry. Why your vendors stick with you even when other companies offer better terms. Why your clients trust your word when timelines get tight." Harold studied me, his eyes thoughtful. "You still care about this place?" "I gave 11 years to it," I said. "I'd rather not see that work undone in 11 days. Calvin opened his mouth, but Harold silenced him with a single look. "What are you proposing, Elena?" I pulled a folder from my bag and slid it across the table. "A consulting arrangement," I said. "I'll help with the transition. Advise on contracts. Prep the new team. In return, I receive the compensation outlined in my agreement, plus a consulting fee." Harold skimmed the documents, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You've thought this through." "It's what you hired me to do," I replied. Harold handed the folder to Calvin. "Read it carefully this time." Calvin accepted the folder with obvious reluctance, his jaw tight, his posture defensive. As he flipped through the pages, I watched the flickers of realization cross his face. His pride may have been wounded, but even he could recognize the strategic value of what I was offering. I saw his eyes widen slightly at the section outlining the consulting scope. "This gives her access to our operations even while she's working for Tricon," he said, his tone rising. "With strict confidentiality provisions," I pointed out calmly, "and a clear delineation of what constitutes proprietary information." Leonard has reviewed the arrangement and approved it. Harold raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "You've already cleared this with Tricon?" "It was a condition of my acceptance," I confirmed. "They get my expertise without the ethical complications." Calvin tossed the folder back onto the table, eyes flashing. "This is blackmail." "No," Harold corrected, his voice calm but firm. "This is negotiation. Something you'd understand if you'd taken the time to learn the business, instead of assuming you could manage it on theory alone." The tension between father and son was thick enough to choke on. I didn't say a word, but I didn't have to. The air in the room shifted as years of unspoken expectations, frustrations, and resentment laid themselves bare in the silence that followed. Veronica, sensing the emotional weight of what was unfolding, quietly excused herself and slipped out, leaving the three of us alone in the aftermath of Calvin's impulsive misstep. "I'll need time to review this proposal," Harold said after a long pause, closing the folder carefully. "Of course," I replied. "But I should mention, my offer to assist with the transition expires at the end of the business day. After that, all communication will go through my attorney regarding the terms of my termination package." Calvin's face reddened. "So you're giving us an ultimatum?" "I'm being practical," I said, keeping my tone even. "My new position demands my full attention, and Tricon has already been generous in allowing this limited overlap. I won't ask them to wait indefinitely." Harold studied me closely. I could feel the weight of his gaze, as if he was searching for resentment, anger, maybe even revenge. Whatever he expected, he didn't find it. "You were always fair, Elena," he said finally, with something like regret in his voice. "Even when you had every reason not to be." He turned to his son. "Calvin, step outside. I need a moment with Elena." Calvin hesitated, clearly itching to stay and defend himself, but something in Harold's tone told him it wasn't optional. With a final scowl in my direction, he stormed out, letting the door slam behind him. "He has potential," Harold said quietly once we were alone. "But he lacks patience. And humility." He ran a hand through his silver hair, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. I thought putting him in charge would force him to grow. I see now that was a mistake. It's not my place to comment on your choices, I said carefully. Harold chuckled, though it held no joy. Diplomatic as ever. But we both know this isn't how I wanted things to end between Ashwood Components and Elena Ward. I felt a pang of nostalgia. 11 years of battles fought, problems solved, and goals exceeded. I had built something here, and now I was walking away from it. Business is business, I said, echoing one of Harold's favorite phrases. He smiled at the familiarity. Indeed. He picked up the folder again. I'll sign this. And I'll make sure Calvin understands the terms and the consequences of violating them. Thank you. But before you go, Harold continued, his voice softer, I want to ask you something off the record. I nodded. What would it take to bring you back? Not now, but in time after things settle. I blinked, caught off guard. Honestly? I don't know. Tricon is offering opportunities one hadn't even considered before. And after what happened, trust is hard to rebuild. Harold nodded slowly. Not impossible, but hard. I thought about it, letting the question hang in the air. If Ashwood wants me back someday, I said finally, it'll need more than a new offer. It'll need a new culture. A different kind of leadership. One that values the people who make this place work. Harold didn't argue. He just listened. Not just the bottom line. Harold let out a quiet whistle. That's a tall order. You asked what it would take, I reminded him. He laughed, a genuine, deep laugh that cut through the tension of the morning. For a brief moment, he looked like the Harold I'd worked with for over a decade, sharp, present, and fully in control. So I did. He extended his hand. No matter what happens next, it's been an honor working with you, Elena. I shook his hand, surprised by the sudden swell of emotion. Likewise, Harold. As I turned to leave, he called after me. Elena, one more thing. I paused at the door. Calvin's going to hate this, but I'm going to insist he attend your transition meetings personally. Consider it part of his education. A smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. That seems appropriate. Outside the conference room, Calvin was pacing like a caged animal, his jaw tight, his eyes still burning with anger. He froze when he saw me. Are you satisfied? He hissed. You've completely undermined my authority on my first day. I met his glare with cool detachment. You did that yourself the moment you fired someone without understanding the consequences. He stepped closer, voice low. This isn't over. Actually, I said, matching his tone, it is. Your father is signing the consulting agreement. You'll be attending every transition meeting. Consider it a crash course in contract management. The look on his face was almost worth everything that had come before. The following Monday, I walked into Tricon Manufacturing's gleaming Detroit headquarters, now my new professional home. My office was on the 18th floor, with a wide view of the downtown skyline, a far cry from the windowless room I'd once occupied at Ashwood. Leonard Phillips met me in the lobby and personally gave me the tour, introducing me to the key team members and outlining my responsibilities. I've been trying to get you over here for years, he said as we sat down in his corner office over coffee. Though I have to admit, the circumstances are a little surprising. Life's full of unexpected turns, I replied, diplomatic as ever. Leonard chuckled. That's one way to put it. The consulting agreement with Ashwood, smart move. Gets us your expertise while avoiding a legal circus. It was the right thing to do, I said. Harold built that company from nothing. I respect him, even if I strongly disagree with how his son is running it. Leonard leaned forward slightly, tone shifting. Speaking of which, the first transition meeting is tomorrow. You ready for that? I nodded. I've put together comprehensive handover notes on all active contracts. My goal is to ensure a clean transition, not to stir up trouble. And Calvin? How do you think he'll handle it? I hesitated, then answered honestly. Poorly. At first. But Harold will keep him in check. Leonard seemed satisfied. Good. Last thing we need is unnecessary drama. In the days that followed, news of my departure from Ashwood and the dramatic fallout reached nearly every corner of Detroit's business circles. Former colleagues reached out, some expressing shock, others discreetly asking about potential openings at Tricon. I kept my responses professional, neither poaching nor slamming any doors. I had no interest in burning bridges, but I also wasn't protecting anyone who no longer deserved loyalty. The first transition meeting at Ashwood was every bit as tense as I had anticipated. Calvin sat across the table, arms crossed, silent and stiff as I walked his team through project handovers, contract nuances, and client preferences. Harold watched from the head of the table, occasionally interjecting with questions or prompting clarification. When the meeting concluded, Harold walked me out, speaking quietly. "Thank you for doing this properly," he said. "It would have been easy to leave them floundering." "That wouldn't help anyone," I replied. "Least of all the clients stuck in the middle." Harold nodded, a glimmer of something unreadable in his eyes. Respect, maybe. Or regret. There was respect in Harold's eyes, quiet and steady. Always the professional. Over the next 2 months, I divided my time between building my foundation at Tricon and fulfilling my consulting obligations at Ashwood. The transition meetings gradually shifted from tense affairs into something more productive. Calvin, to his credit, began asking thoughtful questions. Sometimes he even took notes. It was a far cry from the dismissiveness he'd worn like a badge on his first day as CO. During our final scheduled session, I was gathering my materials when Calvin approached me. "I underestimated you," he said. His voice was steady, his tone measured. And I misjudged the situation. I looked up, surprised by what almost sounded like an apology. "We all make mistakes," I said. "Especially when we're new to a role." He frowned slightly. "That's what my father says too. But it's not an excuse." "No," I agreed. "It's not. But recognizing the mistake is the first step toward not repeating it." He nodded, slowly absorbing that. "The consulting agreement expires next week, right?" I nodded. "Would you consider extending it?" "On a more limited basis. Just for the most complex contracts." That caught me off guard. I hadn't expected him to ask. "I'm not sure that would be appropriate," I replied cautiously, "given my position at Tricon." "I've already discussed it with Leonard Phillips," Calvin admitted. "He's open to it if there are clear boundaries." That definitely caught me off guard. I made a mental note to schedule a conversation with Leonard the moment I got back to my office. "Why me?" I asked. "There are dozens of consultants with contract law expertise." His response was reluctant but honest. "Because you know our business. And because I need to prove to my father that I can learn from my mistakes." I studied him carefully. The arrogance I had once seen in every glance and word was no longer front and center. In its place, I found something new: humility. Earned, perhaps, the hard way. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "That's all I can promise." Calvin nodded. "That's fair." As I left Ashwood Components, possibly for the last time, I couldn't help but reflect on how different the ending had been from what I had anticipated. I had walked away not just with a generous financial package, but with my professional reputation intact, strengthened, even, and with a surprising amount of respect from the very person who had once tried to erase my role entirely. At Tricon, I was thriving. My intimate knowledge of Ashwood's operations had allowed me to identify opportunities that strengthened Tricon's client relationships and helped streamline contract structures. Leonard was pleased, and I'd already been asked to oversee a cross-functional initiative outside the scope of my original role. The agreement Calvin had failed to read had changed the course of my career more than I ever expected. Sometimes, I reflected, the most powerful revenge isn't about tearing someone else down. It's about rising so high, they have no choice but to look up at you. If you followed my story, you know it wasn't just about contracts, clauses, or corner offices. It was about dignity, self-worth, and refusing to let someone else write the ending to your story. I didn't expect support when I walked out of Ashwood that day, but maybe, just maybe, someone like you is reading this and seeing a part of yourself in me. If that's the case, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment. Share your story, your journey, your fight. Remind others that quiet strength, careful strategy, and standing your ground are not just admirable, they're powerful. Your voice matters. Let's create a space where resilience is celebrated, not ignored. To those of you who cheered for me along the way, thank you. Truly, every victory, big or small, feels a little fuller knowing someone else believes in what you've worked for. Tell me, what did you take from this? What would you have done in my place? I read every message, every word, and they mean more than you know. And if you're facing your own version of a Calvin Reyes, someone who underestimated you, tried to dismiss your value, or made you feel small, let me give you this advice. Know your worth before they question it. Prepare your exit before they hand you the door. And most importantly, rise anyway. Because the sweetest kind of revenge isn't vengeance. It's becoming so successful, so unshakably grounded in your purpose, that they can't help but watch you soar. I didn't win because I fought harder. I won because I knew who I was and refused to let anyone, legacy or title, strip that from me. Now tell me, what's your next move? I'm listening.